The Whitmore estate in New York was known for its impeccable gardens, grand chandeliers, and polished marble floors. But on that particular afternoon, even the roses blooming outside the mansion seemed to have lost their scent. Claire Whitmore, 26, walked slowly down the aisle beneath a crystal canopy that shimmered in the pale light. Her dress was a masterpiece, silk embroidered with pearls, delicate lace tracing her arms. She looked like the perfect bride, except for her eyes. They didn't sparkle. They were dull, silent, a painting of compliance. The guests whispered about her beauty, about her father's wealth, about Andrew Carter, the man waiting for her at the altar. Tall, composed, and successful, Andrew was everything her father, David Whitmore, had ever wanted in a son-in-law: loyal, ambitious, controlled. What no one said out loud was the truth. Claire didn't love him. She never had. She wasn't walking toward a future. She was walking into a deal. David watched the ceremony from the front row, his expression a mixture of pride and calculation. For him, the marriage was strategic, a way to secure trust with Carter Industries and more importantly, and with Andrew's influential father. He had spoken to Claire in cold terms weeks before the wedding. "This isn't about love. It's about legacy. You will thank me one day." She hadn't argued, not because she agreed, but because she knew resistance was pointless. At the reception, cameras flashed, speeches echoed against the mansion walls. Champagne flowed freely, but Claire barely touched hers. She danced when asked. She smiled when needed. She laughed, once, at something Andrew said, and immediately regretted it. Everything felt like theater. Her life was no longer her own. In the bridal suite later that night, Claire sat on the edge of the bed staring at her reflection. Her makeup had begun to smudge. The white dress felt like a costume. Andrew entered the room, loosened his tie, and looked at her without a word. There was no tenderness in his gaze, no joy, only obligation. 3 days passed. The honeymoon in a luxurious beach resort in Turks and Caicos was as cold as the marriage. Andrew made polite conversation, booked activities for them, insisted on routines. Claire found herself suffocating in silence. She wrote letters to herself in a notebook, her only escape. Andrew found the notebook and tore the pages without saying a word. On the third evening, after dinner, Claire locked herself in the bathroom. She dialed a number with trembling fingers. Her father answered after the third ring. "Claire, is everything okay?" There was a long silence. Then her voice, broken and shaking, came through the speaker. "Daddy, I need to tell you something. I can't do this anymore. You don't know what he's done to me." David froze. His glass of scotch slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor. David Whitmore paced his study in slow, measured steps. Outside, the skyline of Manhattan glowed with opulence. But inside, his world was unraveling thread by thread. Claire's voice from the call still echoed in his mind, not because of what she said, but how she said it. There had been no rage, no drama, no accusations, just a fragile desperation that chilled him to his core. He had heard broken voices before, employees begging for one more chance and investors pleading for grace. But never his daughter, never Claire. The next morning, he called her. She didn't answer. She sent a message instead. "I'll explain everything when I get back. Please don't call again." For the first time in years, David felt powerless. His empire was built on control, predicting outcomes, steering people, orchestrating results. But here, with his own daughter, he stood in the dark. And the darkness, he realized, was of his own making. When Claire returned from the honeymoon, she didn't go to her apartment. She showed up at the Whitmore penthouse, her suitcase. In one hand, her eyes red but dry. David opened the door himself, unsure of what to say. She walked past him silently and sat on the leather couch, as if the weight of her own skin was too much to carry standing up. He sat opposite her, waiting, unwilling to interrupt. Her words came slowly, like someone relearning how to speak after surviving a trauma. She told him that Andrew hadn't hurt her physically. Not in the way you might be thinking, she clarified. But what followed was worse than he had imagined. Andrew had stripped her of autonomy, hour by hour, in a quiet campaign of psychological suffocation. He dictated what she should, where to dinner. He adjusted the thermostat in their room without consulting her, even when she was cold. He questioned every minute she spent alone, down to when and how long she showered. One afternoon, she had tried to write. Not emails or journals, just a few words, a private letter to herself, like she used to do as a girl. Andrew found the pages and read them without asking. When she asked for them back, he handed them to her in pieces, torn, destroyed, as if her inner world didn't deserve to exist. David's hands clenched involuntarily as she spoke. He tried to interrupt, to say something, anything. But Claire stopped him with a look. She needed to finish. It wasn't just about what he did, she said, her voice low and bitter. It was how he looked at me when he did it, as if he had the right, as if you gave him that right. David leaned back, suddenly nauseated. He had expected challenges. He had expected adjustment issues, but not this. Not a daughter reduced to a shadow of herself in less than a week. And still, there was something else. A pause in Claire's speech that signaled a truth withheld. He noticed it, but said nothing. If fatherhood had taught him anything at all, it was that truth, like grief, surfaces only when it's ready. For the rest of that day, Claire stayed in her room. David sat in his office, the walls of the penthouse pressing in around him. He stared at a framed photo of Laura, Claire's mother, gone for nearly 12 years. Her smile in the picture was soft, wise, almost warning. Guilt began to rot the corners of his confidence. He had always told himself he acted out of protection. But now, for the first time, he wondered if what he had truly protected was his name, not his daughter. That night, as he opened a drawer searching for an old notepad, his hand brushed against something unexpected, a sealed envelope tucked behind a row of documents. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was Laura's. The envelope sat on David's desk like an open wound, yellowed by time, sealed but slightly frayed at the edges. It carried the distinct scent of paper that had waited too long. His hand trembled slightly as he turned it over, seeing his name written in Laura's elegant, deliberate handwriting. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at it for several long minutes, afraid of what it might contain, or worse, what it might confirm. Eventually, he broke the seal. The letter inside was brief but heavy, each word chosen with the same precision Laura had used in every conversation, every argument, every embrace. She wrote of her fears, not about her own illness, she had accepted that fate with a strange grace, but about their daughter's future. She spoke of the way David had begun to treat Claire more like an investment than a person, more like a vessel to carry out a legacy than a life with her own path. And then came the line that turned his blood cold. Please, never make Claire pay for the business deals we couldn't refuse when we were young. Let her choose her own chains if she must wear any. David sat back, breathless. He remembered those early days with Andrew's father, Richard Carter, the handshakes, the dinners, the subtle threats disguised as favors. Back then, Richard had proposed something that David had dismissed as mere business bravado, a merger of bloodlines to cement a financial empire. David had laughed it off, told Laura it was nonsense, and yet here they were. Years later, the same deal had returned in a different shape, not with contracts, but with a wedding ring. Claire found him in his office the next morning. She held a cup of coffee in both hands like a shield, her expression guarded. Before she could speak, David stood and placed the letter in front of her. No words, just the paper. Claire hesitated, but then read it, slowly. Her hands trembled halfway through. When she finished, she didn't cry. She just looked at him, not with anger, but with something far more painful. Recognition. I found that same letter, she said finally. her voice low and steady. "In your office, weeks ago, hidden behind one of the old photo albums." She paused, her lips tightening. "I was going to confront you before the wedding, but part of me wanted to believe you had a reason, a real one, not just this." David wanted to explain. He wanted to reach across the desk and erase the space between them. But Claire raised a hand, not to stop him, but to protect herself. There was something else she hadn't yet told him. She lowered her gaze before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice cracked in the middle of her sentence. "Andrew locked me in a cabin the day after I told him I wanted an annulment." The words hung in the room like smoke after a fire. She went on to describe the small, remote chalet they had stayed in, part of the honeymoon package arranged by Andrew's assistant. It was supposed to be charming, private, and scenic. But when she said she was leaving, when she finally found the courage to speak those words, he didn't argue. He simply left the room, and minutes later, the door wouldn't open. The windows were locked. Her phone was gone. She had spent 24 hours in that place with no way out, no answers, only silence. He returned the next evening as if nothing had happened, offered her wine, asked if she felt better, and Claire had smiled, because she knew then that her safety depended on her pretending to be okay. She had smiled all the way to the airport, smiled through the drive, smiled until she was out of his reach. David was silent. Every cell in his body screamed for retribution, but all he could do was nod. Claire stood, turned to leave, then hesitated. "There's one more thing," she said, her hand already on the door. "You may have forced me into that marriage, but the lies started long before that, and I think you know what I'm talking about." She left before he could ask, but the silence she left behind told him everything. There was more, much more. It was nearly midnight when Claire returned to the study, the folded letter from her mother now tucked into the inside pocket of her cardigan. She hadn't shown it to David yet. She wasn't sure she would. Part of her wanted him to feel the weight of it without the words, to let him wonder what was written inside, the same way she had once wondered what kind of man her father really was beneath the empire he built. The discovery of the letter had not come by accident. It had slipped out from between files marked legal, confidential, buried in a drawer she wasn't supposed to open, but she had opened it. She had opened everything. Laura's words weren't bitter. They were pleading. In the letter, dated just 3 weeks before her death, she begged David not to repeat the cycle she herself had been trapped in, a marriage rooted not in affection, but in alignment, in expectations. She had never agreed to. She reminded him, gently but urgently, that their daughter was not a chess piece to be moved across a board of corporate power plays. The name, Richard Carter, appeared 3 times, each time accompanied by phrases like unfinished, debts, and promises you were too proud to refuse. Claire had read the letter 4 times the night she found it, not because she doubted it, but because she didn't want to. Her mother had known, even as her health faded and her voice weakened. Laura had seen the blueprint forming, the future David was designing without permission. It made Claire's skin crawl to realize her mother had died believing the past might still have time to change course. But nothing had changed. It had only hardened. The next morning, Claire laid the letter on the dining room table without a word. David sat across from her in a robe, his coffee untouched. He read the first paragraph and stopped. His face didn't twist in shock or guilt. It simply fell blank. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice that barely cleared his throat, he asked a single question. "Where did you find this?" The question was unimportant. Claire didn't respond. Instead, she leaned forward, her tone calm but sharp. "I need to know, Dad. Did you make some kind of deal with Richard Carter? Did you sell me off to protect the company?" David hesitated, but only for a moment. "I didn't sell you," he said carefully, each word pressed through gritted teeth. "I made a strategic decision. One I thought you would eventually come to understand. There was no rage in his voice, only fatigue. But Claire could hear it clearly now. The justifications, the elegant cruelty of a man who believed he could control people like stocks. Her hands balled into fists beneath the table. You read that letter, and you still went through with it. Do you realize what that makes you? I realize exactly what it makes me, he said quietly, finally meeting her eyes. It makes me the man who built this family's future. Claire stood, heart pounding, and for the first time since the wedding she felt something solid beneath her rage. Then you can have your future, Dad, but I'm not going to be part of it. She left the house that day without packing, only her purse, her keys, and a small notebook in which she had begun to write again. Not letters to herself, but something new, something unfinished. That night, David opened a bottle of scotch that had been aging for 12 years. The same year Laura died. He didn't drink. He just sat there. The letter remained on the table, lit only by the city lights flickering. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he finally understood. The empire he had spent a lifetime building had a crack at its foundation, and it started with the silence of a woman he had once promised to love. For 2 days, David Whitmore avoided the penthouse dining room where Laura's letter still lay, untouched but unreadable now, as though the paper had absorbed enough pain to turn its words invisible. Claire had moved back into her childhood, room without saying much, claiming she had nowhere else to go, but they both knew that wasn't true. Her return wasn't about shelter, it was about confrontation. David didn't ask questions, didn't press her for forgiveness. Instead, he started showing up in the kitchen at strange hours, pouring coffee, standing in the doorway as if waiting for instructions on how to be human again. Claire observed all this with distant eyes. The man who once scheduled meetings during her piano recitals now offered to drive her to the park. The man who sent assistants to deliver birthday gifts now asked if she wanted to walk to the corner cafe together. It was surreal, and yet it was real, because none of it felt rehearsed. He didn't try to explain away the past. He simply existed beside her, awkward and clumsy in his gestures, like a stranger trying to earn space in a house he thought he owned. Meanwhile, Andrew disappeared. No texts, no calls. His office claimed he was working remotely, but Claire knew better. The man who prided himself on being everywhere, always, had vanished the moment control slipped through his fingers, and though part of her was relieved, another part remained uneasy. Men like Andrew didn't vanish without reason. They receded, like waves, waiting to crash back with greater force. Still, she chose not to chase the silence. Let him stay gone. The tension in the Whitmore home became a quiet truce, a ceasefire marked by shared breakfasts and long, wordless evenings. David surprised her by remembering how she took her tea. He even attempted to cook once, disastrously, and burned an entire tray of croissants he had defrosted improperly. Claire didn't laugh, but she smiled for the first time in days, not because it was funny, but because it was clumsy, genuine. One morning, Claire stood in her old room, surrounded by boxes she never thought she'd open again. Among the dusty ballet shoes and yearbooks, she found a sketchpad filled with drawings of ceramic sculptures. Her old dream, long shelved, long ridiculed by her father, had survived the years like a fossil. That night at dinner, she mentioned it softly and unsure if he would mock it again. But to her surprise, David said nothing. He only nodded, and the next morning, she woke to find a business card on her nightstand. Studio space available, Chelsea District. Ask for Martin. It was the first time her father had given her something without asking for anything. In return, she visited the space that afternoon. A loft with high windows and exposed brick walls. It smelled of plaster and possibility. And it was there, among the scattered clays and half-finished sculptures, that she met him. The first time Claire saw him, he was kneeling beside a block of terracotta, helping a small boy roll out a crooked lump of clay into the shape of what appeared to be a boat, or maybe a dinosaur. The child's brow was furrowed in concentration, his tiny hands stained with earth, and the man beside him didn't rush or correct. He simply watched, patient and quiet, as though the boy's mistakes were part of the beauty. Claire stood in the doorway of the studio for a long moment, before anyone noticed her. When he finally looked up, her breath caught. His eyes were an arresting shade of blue, not the sharp, cold blue of someone trying to impress, but the soft, tired blue of someone who had seen enough pain to understand silence. He introduced himself with a nod and a quiet, "Ethan, that's my son, Noah." There was no extended biography, no boasting, just names. Claire appreciated that. In a world where people often led with resumes, Ethan's simplicity felt like a different kind of strength. Noah waved shyly, clay still clinging to his fingers. Claire bent down, asked what he was making. "A spaceship for Mom," the boy whispered, then looked away. Ethan's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something unspoken, before he turned back to the sculpture and gently wiped his hands clean. They crossed paths again 2 days later, both arriving early. She had just begun organizing shelves when she heard him humming a soft tune from the back of the studio, helping Noah clean brushes. Their interactions were light, unobtrusive. He didn't ask why she looked tired. She didn't ask why he wore a ring on a chain around his neck. But in the quiet between words, something tentative began to grow. A mutual respect for boundaries, and perhaps, or the rare comfort of being seen without being examined. Claire found herself watching him more than she intended. The way he moved through space with intention, the careful way he handled broken pottery as though mending it might mend something else. And there was a sadness to him. Not the performative kind, but the sort that lingered in his posture. And in the way he looked at his son like he was both a blessing and a reminder. She learned, without asking, that he was a widower, that his wife had left him a few months after Noah was born. No explanations. Just an empty apartment and a note that said, "I'm not who I thought I'd be." In the weeks that followed, and Claire began to stay longer at the studio, they spoke in fragments and about glazed temperatures, about the best clay for fine detailing. But it was in the silences that they grew closer. Sometimes she would catch him watching her as she shaped a bowl or carved a line too deep and had to start over. He never offered advice, only presence. And presence, she realized, was something she had long been starved of. Still, there was a truth she hadn't yet voiced, one that clung to her like damp linen. She was still married. Legally. Emotionally, it didn't matter how hollow the bond had become. The paper still bound her. And despite the absence of affection, the knowledge of that tie left her feeling as though every smile she gave Ethan was a kind of betrayal. Of him, of herself. She began to withdraw again, just slightly, leaving the studio a little earlier, choosing not to linger when Noah offered her a clay cup he had made with crooked fingers and pride in his chest. Ethan never questioned her distance, but one afternoon, as she gathered her things, he simply said, "You don't have to be okay for this to be real." He didn't elaborate. He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned back to the kiln, as if nothing had been said. Claire walked out into the cold air, her chest full of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not love. Hope. It was late afternoon when Claire saw him again. She had just stepped out of the studio, her apron still dusted with clay, and when a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb with the kind of smooth precision that only Andrew Carter could command. He emerged as if no time had passed. Tailored coat, hair immaculate. A faint shadow of stubble that seemed less like carelessness and more like a calculated attempt to appear changed. For a moment, Claire simply stood still, not frozen, in fear, but caught in the discomfort of seeing something she thought she had finally outgrown. Andrew offered a smile that hovered somewhere between remorse and arrogance. "Claire," he said, his voice warm in tone but cold beneath the surface, "I've been trying to reach you." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The distance between them, emotional and physical, said everything. Still, he continued, his gaze shifting subtly toward the studio behind her. "I heard you've been busy." They walked briefly, side by side, her silence pressing against his words like stone against paper. He began speaking of change, how the time apart had made him reflect, how he had spoken to his therapist, how he now realized the extent of his emotional rigidity. He admitted to being controlling, but always framed it in terms of structure, stability, even love. "I thought I was protecting us," he said at one point, as if the cage he had built around her had been lined with velvet. Claire listened, without interruption, her thoughts turning not to the past but to how distant it felt now. The girl who had trembled in the chalet's locked room was no longer the woman standing here. Still, when Andrew finally said, "I'd like to try again," the air thickened with a tension she hadn't expected, not because she wanted to return, but because part of her had feared this moment, the inevitable appearance of the man who had always believed she was his to reclaim. She turned to face him fully, steady but calm. "We were never a we," she said. "We were a contract signed by fear and legacy. You know it. I know it. My father knows it now too." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin envelope. "I've already filed the annulment," he said. "You'll get the confirmation in a few days." Claire blinked, momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected him to surrender control so easily. Andrew took a breath, and for the first time, the facade dropped. What he said next was quieter, less rehearsed. "I didn't love you, Claire, but I also didn't hate you. I was just trying to survive my father. I thought doing this would free me. I didn't realize it would destroy you." There it was, the one truth they had both known, but never dared say aloud, that this marriage had been a shared prison, forged by men who had once been boys too afraid to fail the names they inherited. Claire nodded slowly, and for the first time in all their conversations, there was no venom between them. Just two people standing in the ruins of something they never built together. When Andrew walked away, he didn't look back. Claire didn't call out. She simply turned toward the studio, where the warm light spilled from the windows and the faint sound of Noah's laughter drifted through the glass. Inside, the world was waiting. Not perfect, but hers. The days that followed Andrew's departure felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but quieter in a way Claire hadn't expected. Finality had a strange texture. It didn't arrive like a crash or a storm. It seeped in slowly, like dusk, softening the edges of everything. She walked through the studio with a calmness that wasn't quite peace, but no longer pain. Her movements were slower, more deliberate. She molded clay with a sense of presence she hadn't known in years, her fingers relearning the texture of freedom. Ethan noticed the shift in her before she ever spoke about it. He said nothing directly. He rarely did. But his eyes lingered a little longer on her face, his posture slightly less guarded. They began to fall into rhythm, not in sweeping romantic gestures, but in the quiet rituals that build a different kind of intimacy. Cleaning brushes side by side, drinking coffee on the cold steps behind the studio while Noah played nearby. Their words remained minimal, but the silence between them had changed, no longer empty, but charged with something neither of them dared name. Still, love, or even the suggestion of it, came with its own weight. Claire could feel it creeping in not from Ethan but from herself, and that terrified her. She had spent so long navigating through someone else's version of affection, where control wore the mask of care, that now, even kindness felt dangerous. She would find herself pulling away just when things felt warm, retreating behind polite nods, avoiding eye contact when Ethan offered her a smile that lingered a second too long. And Ethan, for all his patience, wasn't immune to hesitation either. One late afternoon, after Noah had fallen asleep in the corner with a lump of half-dried clay in his hand, Claire found Ethan staring out the window, his expression distant. She sat beside him, and after a long pause, he said quietly, "My wife left 6 weeks after Noah was born. No fight, no warning, just a letter on the kitchen table, and silence that never stopped echoing. His voice didn't tremble, but Claire could feel the ache beneath it. Since then, I've learned to expect people to leave. I've built a life that doesn't depend on anyone staying. Claire didn't respond immediately. She didn't reach for his hand or offer hollow reassurances. Instead, she turned her gaze toward Noah, curled in sleep on the studio floor. I was taught love is a contract, she said softly, that it's something signed, not felt. And even when I knew it wasn't true, part of me still believed I had to earn it by staying silent, obedient, small. They sat in silence again, the room dimming with the onset of evening. Outside, the streetlights buzzed into life, casting long shadows across the studio walls. It would have been easy to fill the space with promises or declarations, but neither of them needed that. What they needed was to be understood, and more than that, to be allowed to remain uncertain. When Claire left that night, she turned to Ethan at the door and, with a quiet breath, said, "I'm still learning what love is supposed to feel like, but when I'm here, it doesn't feel wrong." Ethan didn't move. He only nodded once, as if that single gesture contained everything he couldn't yet say. It was a gray Sunday afternoon when David Whitmore saw him. He had left the penthouse on a whim, a rare unplanned walk through Central Park, his thoughts swirling in restless loops, when he caught sight of a familiar figure kneeling in the grass near the conservatory pond. The man was helping a small child tie a loose shoelace, his posture relaxed, his movements gentle. David paused mid-step, realizing who it was before the name even formed in his mind. Ethan Brooks. There was nothing remarkable about him, at first glance, not by the standards David was used to. No tailored suit, no bodyguards, no sense of urgency radiating from his movements. But there was something undeniably grounding about the way he existed in the space around him, as though he wasn't trying to outrun anything. That, more than anything, unnerved David. Because for all his power, he had never known that kind of stillness. He waited until the boy, Noah, ran ahead toward a cluster of ducks, then approached. Ethan turned, surprised, but not startled. David introduced himself simply, without pretense. "Claire's father," he said, as if that title now carried more weight than CEO. Ethan offered a firm handshake, polite, but cautious. The two men sat on a bench in a silence that neither of them rushed to fill. Eventually, David spoke. He told Ethan about the letter, about Laura, about the deal that was never a contract but may as well have been. For the first time in decades, he didn't speak like a businessman. He spoke like a man who had loved someone and failed her. He didn't dramatize it, didn't beg for understanding, but his words were heavy, deliberate. "I thought I was doing what fathers do, protecting the future, preserving the name. I thought legacy mattered more than freedom, and I buried that belief so deep. It took my daughter's silence to hear it scream." Ethan didn't interrupt. He listened with the kind of attention that made words come easier. When David finally looked up, there was no judgment in Ethan's expression, only quiet comprehension. "Claire isn't a fragile woman," Ethan said after a while. "But she was made to feel like one, and that kind of injury doesn't bleed, it burrows." David nodded, his eyes clouded by a guilt he no longer had the strength to disguise. "She cares for you," he said finally. "I can see it. And I don't know if you love her, or if you're just both trying to heal in the same place. But if you ever make her feel small again, I won't care how gentle you seem." The warning wasn't sharp. It wasn't cruel. It was simply honest. Ethan met his gaze and replied, "I don't want to be her answer, I just want to be her choice, and if she ever makes one." That evening, David returned home and found Claire in the kitchen, her hands in a bowl of flour, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She looked up, surprised to see him home so early. He didn't say much, just walked over and stood beside her, watching her knead the dough. A long silence passed between them before he spoke, voice low and unfamiliar. "I met Ethan today." Claire froze. For a moment, she didn't breathe. But when she turned to him, there was no fear in her face, only curiosity. David didn't wait for questions. He leaned against the counter, the faint scent of yeast and memory wrapping around them. I've made a lot of decisions in my life that looked like success on paper and felt like loss in my chest. But today, I apologized to a stranger for failing you. And I meant it. Claire looked at him carefully, unsure if it was safe to believe him, but he didn't try to explain himself further. He didn't retreat behind titles or past authority. He just stood there, hands empty, eyes tired, and for the first time entirely human. And in that moment, Claire saw the father she had almost forgotten existed. The cold had returned to the city overnight, draping the streets in a thin mist and dulling the usual hum of traffic. Claire arrived early at the studio, her breath curling in the air as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was silent, dimly lit by the soft gray light filtering through the tall windows. She hadn't expected anyone to come by that morning. Her only plan was to finish glazing the last set of bowls before the weekend exhibit, her first since returning to herself. She was halfway through unpacking a crate of clay when the door opened. No knock, no grand entrance, just the quiet creak of old hinges. She turned, and there he was, Ethan, standing in the threshold, a paper cup in one hand and something else folded in the other. He didn't speak immediately. He just walked toward her with the slow ease of someone who knew this moment mattered more than he could afford to ruin with words. When he reached her, he handed her the coffee. It was hot, fragrant, exactly the way she liked it, a detail that landed more deeply than she expected. Then he held out the other item, a small, hand-torn piece of paper. Claire took it with a wary curiosity, unfolding it with careful fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably his, uneven but clear. "Would you like to try?" No promises, no timelines, just you, me, and Noah. Claire didn't move. She stared at the note, heart stilled by its simplicity. No confessions, no declarations, just an invitation, one that didn't ask her to be ready, only willing. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the paper as she looked up at him, searching for anything false in his expression. There was none. Ethan wasn't offering her a savior. He was offering her space, and the quiet bravery of being present. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. There was too much sacredness in the silence between them. Instead, Claire placed the cup on the work table beside her, folded the note once more, and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She gave him the smallest of nods, not as a final answer, but as a first step. Ethan smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to show that he understood. Then he reached for his scarf, draped it around his neck, and gestured gently toward the door. She followed. Outside, the morning light was beginning to break through the clouds, casting pale gold over the sidewalk. Noah stood near the bench across the street, bundled in his coat, waving the moment he saw her. Claire waved back, her hand trembling only slightly. And then, without any grand gesture or closing line, she walked toward the park, beside a man, behind a child, into a world she didn't yet trust, but was finally willing to meet. Months passed, and the chill of winter gave way to the cautious softness of spring. In a modest gallery on the edge of Soho, people wandered between white walls and soft lights, pausing before sculptures that bore no labels, only titles etched into the base. Held breath. Firing. Line. Stillness after. And one at the center, more delicate than the others, shaped like a fractured heart reassembled by golden seams. Inheritance. Claire stood near the back of the room, not to avoid attention, but because watching from the edge felt more natural than standing at the center. She wore no name tag, no designer gown, just a simple dress with clay still hidden under her fingernails. She greeted visitors with a calm smile, answered a few questions, accepted compliments without deflecting them. Her art, once buried under years of someone else's plans, now stood quietly in the open, bruised, imperfect, beautiful. It didn't scream for attention, it simply existed, like she had learned to do. David arrived late, walking, with the careful steps of a man still learning how to be seen without power to shield him. His hair was thinner, his posture less rigid, but there was something lighter in his presence. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but surrender. He had retired a month earlier, stepping down from the empire he once called his life. Now, he held a camera in one hand and a backpack in the other. Inside the backpack was a set of storybooks and small plastic dinosaurs, waiting for the little boy who called him Grandpa Dave, even though no one asked him to. Noah ran into the gallery a few minutes later, wide-eyed and tugging at Ethan's hand, excited by the echo of his voice against the walls. Claire watched them approach, her heart full but quiet. Ethan met her gaze across the room, didn't wave, didn't smile broadly, just gave her that same soft nod he had given her the day he offered coffee and a folded note. It had become their silent contract. No promises, just presence. Later, as the gallery emptied and the evening softened into the city's golden haze, Claire stepped outside for air. She carried no sculptures, no speech prepared, only a sense of something new taking root. David stood nearby with Noah on his shoulders, pointing out constellations that hadn't yet appeared. Ethan joined her, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon like he wasn't looking for anything, just appreciating that nothing was chasing him anymore. Claire didn't speak for a long time. She didn't need to. The scent of the nearby roses drifted on the breeze, faint but unmistakably real. Once, she had walked down an aisle holding a bouquet that felt like a cage. Now, she stood, in a city she hadn't left, living a life she had never planned, and for the first time in years, the roses didn't just have scent, they smelled like home.